Leonard Long is going to talk on Galileo and his trial by the Roman Catholic Church, and this is depicted frequently as a tension or a war between science and the church. And this is an oversimplified picture, and so Leonard is going to give us a lot fuller description of what really happened. Leonard is former doctor, right, retired doctor, and has also been a student at Table College. And are you currently studying for your Masters?
In the background.
In the background, so probably very slowly. And he's done a lot of research on Galileo, as well as the Enlightenment and deism and all sorts of interesting stuff. So we look forward to hear what you'll say. And thank you very much for offering to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, the Galileo trial is possibly the most infamous trial in science. Its rivals are the monkey trial of the United States in the 1930s and the Vavilov trial in Russia in the 1940s. There were two stages of trial, 1616 and 1633, where Galileo ended up under house arrest. What was it all about? There are two views of this. The best known view is that, what I call the view from the outside, which was that it was the Roman Catholic Church shutting down science. And this was the view invented in the late 19th century by Draper, White and Lecky, with their thesis of there being a war between science and religion. Their scholarship was suspect, to put it politely, and their charge is now dismissed by any serious historians who study the case, but it lives on as an urban myth. So what is the myth? Essentially that Copernicus proved that the Earth goes round the sun. This contradicted scripture, therefore it was wrong. Galileo proved that the Earth goes round the sun. The Inquisition told Galileo to shut up. Galileo refused to shut up. He was threatened with torture and recanted. Therefore there is a war between science and Christianity, and that science flourishes best in a democracy free of religious or political controls. Now, as you'll see, almost all of this is wrong. So what I'm presenting to you tonight is the view from inside, which is that this trial was about the control of the interpretation of Scripture given the best scientific evidence of the day. And these two features are completely ignored. The control of Scripture is recognised in some of the modern historians on the subject, but the other aspect is ignored. 1992, the Pontifical Academy made a report on the trial to the Pope, and they said, the majority of theologians in the Galileo trial did not recognise the formal distinction between the sacred Scripture and its interpretation. They confused the realms of faith and science. But even the Pontifical Academy left out the evidence base of what was done. The big question always has been, does the Earth move? And what I find fascinating is that Aristotle rejected the ancients who said that the Earth circled the sun. It was an ancient idea in Aristotle's time. And he rejected this idea because he could not measure annual stellar parallax. Now this diagram you are going to see over and over through this, because this is the evidence on which the whole trial was based. So you need to understand it well. The sun is at the centre. Aristotle was saying, now if you're claiming that the Earth goes round the sun, this is what you ought to measure. You're saying that the sun is at the centre of the Earth's movement and it goes around the sun in an orbit. If you're saying that, the evidence for this should be that if there's a star way out here and you measure that angle of that star when you're over here in midwinter, then 6 months later, when you're on the other side of the sun, 300 million kilometres away, and you measure the angle of that star, it should be a different angle. That is the scientific evidence which will run right through this trial. Aristotle tried to measure it and couldn't measure it. So he put the Earth as the centre of the universe, and people say, oh, when Copernicus moved the Earth from its central wonderful position. No, it wasn't. In Aristotelian philosophy, the Earth was the rubbish dump of the universe. This was where change and decay occurred. It's the heavens that were the site of perfection, where there is no change and no decay. And because the heavens are the site of perfection, there is no change in the heavens and everything moves in perfect circular motion, which is the only movement that is perfect. And Aristotle developed a physics for all movement on Earth and in the heavens, which caused all sorts of problems later on. But this Aristotelian universe could not and did not survive making the Earth a planet of the sun. Ptolemy, who flourished around 150 AD, also could not measure annual stellar parallax of stars, so he built his Ptolemaic universe with a central stable Earth. Yes, there he is with this same diagram, and he set out to measure the angle of these stars 6 months apart and could not measure it. So therefore he put up his, what is known famously as the Ptolemaic universe. The Earth is the centre of the universe. The Moon is our closest neighbour, travels around us, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and out at the limit are the stars, which are fixed. And everything here travels in perfect circles. Well, when they measured it a bit, they could see that it wasn't perfect circles. So what they had to do to make this work was to add circles on circles, which gets horribly complicated, but we won't worry about that. We'll treat it all as perfect circles. The important point here is that both Aristotle and Ptolemy built their cosmology on the best observational science and reasoning of their day. They didn't just dream it up. They worked hard to work it out. The early church fathers on science, cosmology and all of this said, don't link Christian faith to matters that are irrelevant to salvation, especially not to matters which require detailed study that interferes with devout meditation. What scientists study is how God made things and how God makes things work. Leave them to it and don't worry about it. It's not going to contradict anything because it's all studying God's handiwork. Don't worry. Augustine even said that a heretic may well be better informed in astronomy than a Christian because they put their time and effort into it. And he further said that anything in the Bible where that cannot be related directly to good morals or the true faith should be taken as figurative. So we jump from there to 1513 with Copernicus and his heliocentrism, his sun-centred universe, which is on this model. The sun is the centre of the universe, Mercury is closest, Venus next, Earth is the third planet, with the Moon travelling in perfect circles around the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the fixed stars. Again, believing in perfect circles, so they still had all their circles on circles and equants and all sorts of adjustments to hold their belief system. And it is often said with this outside view that the Roman Catholic Church squashed, disagreed with, totally rejected Copernicanism at the start. Well, not really, because Copernicus came up with this idea in 1513. He sent it around to astronomers, and the next year, the Lateran Council of the Roman Catholic Church asked Copernicus to look after calendar reform because they realised that the calendar had gotten about 10 days out of kilter. And they asked him, because with all of this, he was the best astronomer around. But Copernicus said not enough was known, so he set about measuring accurately. And what he came up with in the end, about 70 years later, was the calendar that we have now. There's an interesting little sideline. Copernicus's first publication in 1522 was a little book on how to control inflation. It was a problem back then. 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door, which is supposed to have started the Reformation, even though none of these theses had anything to do with the Reformation. And the Protestants, with all their arguments against the Roman Catholic Church, came up with this doctrine of sola scriptura. Only the Scripture is what we refer to and take our beliefs from. But the problem was, everyone interpreted it differently, so they started splitting straight away over what the Scriptures meant. And this made the Bible into the battleground of Protestantism rather than the unifying factor. In 1533, Wittgenstein presented Copernicus's heliocentrism to the Pope and cardinals in the Vatican Gardens, and it was well received. They were intrigued with it. And Cardinal Schönberg was so impressed that in 1536 he urged Copernicus to publish an offer to pay costs. Now, because people say the Roman Catholic Church rejected this idea right from the beginning, we are now going to read all of Cardinal Schönberg's letter. Nicholas Schönberg, Cardinal of Capua, to Nicholas Copernicus, greetings. Some years ago, word reached me concerning your proficiency, of which everyone constantly spoke. At that time, I began to have a very high regard for you, and also to congratulate our contemporaries among whom you enjoyed such great prestige. For I have learned that you have not merely mastered the discoveries of the ancient astronomers uncommonly well, but had also formulated a new cosmology. In it, you maintain that the Earth moves, that the Sun occupies the lowest and thus the central place in the universe, that the eighth heaven, which is where the stars are, remain perpetually motionless and fixed, and that the Earth, together with the elements included in its sphere, the Moon, situated between the heavens of Mars and Venus, revolves around the Sun in a period of a year. He clearly understood what Copernicus was saying. I have also learned that you have written an exposition of this whole system of astronomy, and that you have computed the planetary motions and set them down in tables to the greatest admiration of all. Therefore, with the utmost earnestness, I entreat you, most learned sir, unless I inconvenience you, to communicate this discovery of yours to scholars, and at the earliest possible moment to send me your writings on the sphere of the universe, together with the tables and whatever else you may have that is relevant to the subject. Moreover, I have instructed Theodoric of Redon to have everything copied in your quarters at my expense and dispatched to me. If you gratify my desire in this matter, you will see that you are dealing with a man who is zealous for your reputation and eager to do justice to so fine a talent. Farewell. Rome, 1st of November 1536. This was from a senior member of the Roman hierarchy, and this was their attitude to this wonderful new idea. Copernicus put this letter as the frontispiece to his publication, which was dedicated to the Pope who had heard this presentation. Bishop Gysi also encouraged and assisted its publication, and it was seen through the press by a Lutheran theologian named Osiander. Against Aristotle, Copernicus quoted these ancients who argued that the Earth was in motion, and quite a few in between. Copernicus had to vastly increase the size of the universe since he could not measure annual stellar parallax. Yes, there it is again. He looked for it too, tried hard to measure it, and it wasn't there. So he knew his theory was in a bit of trouble. The real evidence wasn't available. And the other problem was it was enormously mathematical, it simplified nothing, and equal accuracy demanded equal complexity. No great advance. Unfortunately, interestingly, Osiander wrote a preface which said, amongst other things, "For it is not necessary for these hypotheses to be true, or even for them to be probable. It is enough already if they provide a calculation which agrees with the observations." Copernicus held this book on his deathbed, and if he'd understood that bit, he would have revolted, because he thought he was describing reality. None of this scholastic thinking. But the interesting thing is, the Protestants were going through a bout of scholastic thinking, and this is scholastic thinking on the hypothetical nature of scientific explanations. Nothing to do with the new science that was gradually developing at this time. 1545 to 1563, the Roman Catholic Church called the Council of Trent to clean up the mess they'd gotten into. Now you need to understand that when the Roman Catholics talk about the Reformation, they're talking about the Council of Trent. And what Protestants call the Reformation, the Roman Catholics call schismatic heresy. Slightly different terminology. Even though Copernicus's ideas were flourishing all around the place and everybody was aware of them, the Council of Trent did not address astronomy. It wasn't interested, not significant for the Christian faith. But they did define who could interpret Scripture because of the Protestant splinterings over their sola scriptura. Anybody could have a go at anything, and we have now, what, 34,000 Protestant groups in the world? It still goes on. So they fixed on the unanimous agreement of the Church Fathers as a basis for biblical interpretation. And none of them advised making worldly knowledge depend on faith. Christoph Rothman wrote to Tycho Brahe around 1600 and appealed to God's omnipotence to fix Copernicus's system because they didn't have a physics for it. And even after the Galileo trials were all over, this appeal to God's omnipotence to make the system work was repeated by the Copernicans. So we come to Kepler, who took Tycho Brahe's work and came up with the 3 laws of planetary motion. An amazing piece of work. I have seen photocopies of the pages of his work, or some of the pages, and it is just masses and masses of numbers. And I look at that and I think he could go from that to imagining where the planets were and what they were doing out there in space. The only comparable skill I can think of for that is an orchestral conductor who can look at a massively complicated score, which is all black notes on paper, and he can hear the music. Amazing skill. But Kepler also cast horoscopes. Copernicus, Kepler and Galileo all cast horoscopes for a living. It was still the continuation of that bit. Even though the early church had banned astrology and horoscopes, it will come up again later because one of the popes gets into trouble over this. So it was a mixture of old and new belief systems and numerology and mathematics and all sorts of things. And Kepler looked for annual stellar parallax, this proof that everybody knew was needed. And Kepler and Galileo had discussions about, in correspondence discussions, about this evidence that they needed to look for. And they encouraged each other to look for it, and Tycho Brahe and everybody, and nobody could find it. In 1596, Kepler produced his work Mysterium Cosmographicum. He was a Lutheran, so he was free to write an extensive chapter reconciling heliocentrism with biblical passages. The important point for this whole episode is that Galileo was not free because the Council of Trent had locked down who could interpret Scripture. Kepler used the accommodation theory that God writes Scripture accommodated to our simple ideas and perspectives. And to quote something neutral, he used a line from some of Virgil's poetry. We left the harbour and the lands and cities retreated. And what Kepler was saying was, that's the way it appears. And this quote comes up quite a few times in the discussion around this trial and all of that. And the interesting thing is sometimes they get very close to the concept of relativity of motion. Interesting way they developed that couple of lines of poetry. The famous bit is, of course, Joshua, "Sun, stand thou still." And Joshua, what Kepler said was that Joshua put his request to God in terms of what he saw. God understood Joshua's words and fulfilled it so as to give the appearance that Joshua asked for. And in this, Kepler had the backing of the early church fathers who said, look, we don't know how God works in anything. We see what God does, but don't pretend you ever understand how God does it. And that was the basis of Kepler's reinterpretation of the various bits of scripture. So we finally arrived at Galileo, in old age there with his telescope in right hand. Oh, mine doesn't want to work anymore. So I'll look up here anyway. In 1595, Galileo became convinced that the tides were the sea sloshing around because of the Earth's two movements, and he kept this belief, ignoring Kepler's synchronising of tides with the moon. Galileo, interestingly, took no notice of his contemporaries and their contributions to science. If they contributed to what he wanted, yes. If they didn't, he ignored them, and he even ignored this. In 1610, he used his new-fangled telescope to discover 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. And this was a problem for the Aristotelian system because everything had to circle around the Earth, not around the planet of Jupiter. Now look at the telescope there. A simple long instrument on a small tripod. You'll see later on the sort of telescope that was needed to measure stellar parallax. So about these 4 moons of Jupiter, in 1610, Galileo wrote this Starry Messenger, which caused great excitement mixed with violent reactions from Aristotelian philosophers and astronomers. They said that this was optical illusions produced in the glass of the telescope. And that's a reasonable assertion because the glass of those days was green and faulty. The Aristotelian professors Cremonini and Giulio Libri refused ever to look at the sky through a telescope, which is important because the accusation from outside is that it was the theologians who refused to look through it. It was the Aristotelians who didn't. And with this publication, also publications began against this nonsense. 1611, Cardinal Bellarmine, who's important in this whole episode, asked the Jesuit astronomers to certify Galileo's discoveries. The Jesuits verified that the telescope was doing what Galileo said it was, that these were not artefacts produced in the glass. They just disagreed with Galileo's interpretation of his findings. Cardinal Bellarmine, once it had been verified, then looked through Galileo's telescope to see what it was doing for himself. Then Galileo used his telescope to try and measure annual stellar parallax. 6 months apart, even with his telescope magnifying things, he could not find this primary proof of what he was on about. In 1613, at a state dinner, an Aristotelian professor said that Galileo's heliocentrism was wrong, his sun-centred universe, because it contradicted the Bible. Now, what's going on here? The thing is, the Aristotelians wanted to shut Galileo up, but they didn't have a mechanism for it. The Roman Catholic Church had the mechanism with its Inquisition to shut Galileo up, but they were not interested. And the story as it developed from here is that the Aristotelians have aimed at and eventually succeeded in tripping up the Roman Catholic Church into using its Inquisition against Galileo. The Pigeon League in one of the northern wealthy cities bitterly opposed Galileo. Their central concern was the preservation of the doctrines and status of the Aristotelian academic community, for which they had an implacable commitment. And they started encouraging preaching against Galileo in this silly doctrine. 1613, Galileo wrote a letter to Castelli, actually a small book, on the relationship of science and scripture. He said, first of all, the Bible needs interpretation because it spoke metaphorically for common people. What he's getting at here is that it speaks in the common language like we still refer to sunrise and sunset, even though we know that that's not what happens. This is what Galileo is getting at. He realised that the whole Aristotelian schism would have to be scrapped if this new model was true. And he also pointed out that only a few bits of the Bible would need reinterpretation. And he said that expert theologians would take their cues from astronomy and physics. He didn't invent that last point, as you will see later. This came from the theologians. 1615, Foscarini produced a letter, which is yet another book, on the compatibility of Scripture with Copernicanism. And this Foscarini is a one-hit wonder. We know almost nothing about Foscarini, and he died shortly afterwards. Ciampolo from Rome wrote to Galileo, "Since the book definitely enters into the Scriptures, it runs a great risk of being condemned by the Vatican." So it was recognised that the Vatican was worried about scriptural interpretation, not the astronomy. 12th of April 1615, Cardinal Bellarmine warned that this was much more difficult than Foscarini suggested. And Bellarmine wrote to Foscarini and Galileo and told them to treat Copernicanism as theory only, not as fact or reality. Bit of the scholastic hangover again. Bellarmine said, "You scientists produce the scientific evidence. Then the Church will ask the theologians, who are the qualified ones, to reinterpret these few scriptural passages. Because without scientific proof, we're not going to put them to all that work because it's only hypothetical. We're not going to fuss about it until you provide the proof." Galileo, in his notes alongside Bellarmine's letter, concedes to Bellarmine that there was no conclusive proof of the motion of the earth. And a bit like Richard Dawkins, he said, "We do not ask anyone to believe this point without a demonstration." He had three factors that he thought proved that the Earth goes round the Sun. One was the phases of Venus, second was the planets of Jupiter, but they could both be fitted into the old cosmology. And he believed that the tides were crucial. He was just wrong on this because he ignored Kepler. The problem was no annual stellar parallax. There it is again, that famous diagram you'll see a few more times yet. They all look for it. 1615, Chasey wrote to Galileo from Rome, "Don't write anything at the moment so as not to awaken the passions of the most powerful Aristotelians," not the theologians. So Galileo's response to all this good advice was to expand his letter to Foscarini into the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. And this is a very important letter in the whole history of the interaction of science and theology. And I suggest you get it off the internet. It's well worth a read. He cited Augustine and other church authorities on biblical interpretation. And he said again, "The language of the Bible is accommodated to the understanding of the common person so as to be clear about what is needed for salvation. If science has established that a natural proposition is certain, then the exegete should interpret the Bible accordingly." Well, that's what Bellarmine told him. You go and find the scientific proof, then we'll do it. And as one historian who studied it closely said, as a piece of scriptural exegesis, Galileo's theological letters are much superior to Bellarmine's, while as an essay on scientific method, Bellarmine's letter is far sounder and more modern in its views on proof and explanation than Galileo's. They're each better at the other fellow's job. Cardinal Bellarmine is one of my heroes in all of this. He died a pauper in this day of prince bishops when they were enormously wealthy, because he lived and ate simply, except for his formal clerical job for whatever his position was, and all his life he gave everything else away to the poor. And he was also a formidable opponent because he carefully, unlike Dawkins, he carefully studied his opponent's case. So much so that when he was a bishop in Belgium, the Protestants hated arguing with him because he knew their case better than they did and he could use it against them. But with all of this going on, he was far more concerned with the loss of piety and Christian living than with any astronomical arguments. They didn't fuss him at all. Because back in 1572, when he was a 30-year-old, he'd said, "I say it is not the task of the theologian to analyse this order of phenomena, especially when the controversies over the explanations are still lively among the astronomers. Leave them to it. Wait until they sort it all out before you even think about it." Possibly Cardinal Bellarmine there's a bit of debate about this, advised the Pope to submit the disputed propositions to the theological qualifiers. The Aristotelians had won. Only the unmistakable theological claim which was made here by the Copernicans led to the trial in March 1616. This is by a Lutheran theologian who studied the case. But interestingly, the 2 points put to the theological qualifiers were astronomical, not theological. First, that the sun is the centre of the world and totally immovable as to locomotion. Censure, all say that the said proposition is foolish and absurd in science and formally heretical inasmuch as it contradicts literal scripture and contradicts the church fathers and doctors of theology. The first strike against it, note, is science, and they said it is foolish and absurd, not false, which provided an escape clause if annual stellar parallax was found in the future. Yes, that measurement again. They knew that this was back there, they knew the astronomers were looking for it, so they allowed for it. Formerly heretical was the strongest category of church censure. But Galileo, now you probably don't know IFF, this is a philosophical term for if and only if. Galileo said, these constraints about the early church fathers and the theologians' writings apply if and only if the theologians have specifically addressed that subject. It's got to be more than just passing references to be taken seriously. Second point, that the earth is neither in the centre of the world nor immovable, but moves as a whole and in daily motion. Censure. All say this proposition receives the same censure in science but as with regard to theological verity, it is at least erroneous in the faith. Again, notice science first, then the theology. Not formally heretical, but at least erroneous in the faith, which meant it doesn't contradict anything in Scripture. In both cases, the theological qualifiers had shifted the responsibility for the interpretation to science where it was relevant. And almost all astronomers of the day would have agreed with them, but they were not formally consulted. The theologians knew that this is what virtually all the astronomers said, but because they didn't ask them to make a report on it, the blame has always remained on the Roman Catholic Church, not on the astronomers of the day. The cardinals in the Vatican received this report and they could have rejected the judgment. Instead, they strengthened the condemnation. And they said that this Pythagorean doctrine, Pythagoras was one of the ancients that Aristotle had rejected. The Pythagorean doctrine of the mobility of the earth and the immobility of the sun, which is false and completely contradictory to divine scriptures. The science is first again, but it's now labelled as false, and they had also locked down biblical interpretation. Pope Paul V wanted to declare Copernicus contrary to the faith, but Cardinals Caetani and Maffeo Barberini, later to be Pope Urban VIII at the second trial, withstood the Pope openly and checked him with good reasons. Pope Paul V instructed Cardinal Bellarmine to admonish Galileo, and there are two conflicting reports of what went on at this meeting. Bellarmine said that the hypothesis cannot be defended or held, but can be discussed, whereas the Vatican note said, nor henceforth to hold, teach or defend it in any way, either verbally or in writing, which rules out all discussion. Now, this unsigned note was in the trial documents, which broke Roman Catholic Church law. You are not allowed to put an unsigned document in trial documents, and it's critical later. Galileo had a long audience with Pope Paul V, who assured Galileo against his enemies, the Aristotelians. Cardinal Bellarmine certified that Galileo had not been on trial, nor had he been condemned by the Inquisition. This letter produced confusion in the 1633 trial because it was not as strong nor as complete as the Vatican's unsigned note, and Bellarmine was dead by then. Comets appeared and were discussed because, as I said, Aristotelian universe, the heavens have no change, they are perfect. Comets were a change in the heavens because the telescope showed that they were above the level of the moon. The astronomy books were theologically corrected, not astronomically corrected, 1621, Cardinal Bellarmine died. 1623, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. And the papal secretary of the new pope wrote to Galileo to resume publication of his ideas, because this new pope never ceases from admiring your eminence and preserves intact his attachment for you. You should not deprive the world of your productions. 1624, a Jesuit astronomer said, when a demonstration that motion of the earth has been found, then it would be necessary to interpret the few passages of sacred scripture otherwise than has been done. So here is a Jesuit astronomer going against the formal findings of the 1616 trial. The scientists were not impressed, and they had a few cautionary notes over the next few decades. In the critical year of 1632, Galileo produced his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. He left out his contemporaries Tycho Brahe and Kepler. The Copernican side clearly wins, but his diplomatic skills were appalling. His biggest supporter, most important supporter in the world, Pope Urban VIII, had had several discussions with him, and he put the words and thoughts of Pope Urban VIII in the mouth of the stubborn, ignorant fool Simplicius in this dialogue. Not a way to win your important friend. So here's Pope Urban VIII. As Cardinal Barberini, he supported Galileo vigorously and often. As Pope Urban VIII, initially he enthusiastically supported Galileo. But in 1632, Pope Urban VIII changed from supporting and defending Galileo to driving the case against him, and drove it to an extreme. Three factors changed Pope Urban VIII. I told you astrology was important in those days. A horoscope had been cast, and Pope Urban VIII was threatened by astrological predictions of his imminent death and had a violent reaction to this with bizarre New Age treatments to protect him from this, which led to accusations of superstition. And he reacted violently against this and against all astronomers, putting one to death just to prove he didn't really believe it. The military, political, Protestant mess was going on. The confused 30-year war, which is labelled as a religious war, but it was anything but. Everybody was fighting everybody, had shifting allegiances and alliances. Cardinal Borgia openly and violently attacked the Pope for favouring the Protestants. Sweden was the superpower of Europe at this time. And the Pope had negotiated behind the scenes for Sweden to crunch the Viennese, the Austrian, Habsburg Empire, because he needed to change the balance of power across Europe. And the Pope was openly accused of nepotism and earthly ambitions. Now, these attacks on the Pope are one of the results of the Council of Trent. People were much more open and prepared to say these sorts of things about nepotism is appointing his friends and relatives to high office, and earthly ambition. And the third thing was the Galileo trial and writings. For some reason, the Galileo trial papers were opened, and they found this unsigned trial memorandum which surprised even the Pope, who decided that Galileo had deceived the Pope, betrayed the Pope, disobeyed the Pope, and had mocked and ridiculed the Pope by putting his words and thoughts in the mouth of the stubborn, ignorant fool Simplicio. Not a way to win friends. So the trial. Galileo wasn't shoved down in the dungeons. He was given a comfortable apartment, provided with his own domestics and food. Cardinal Francesco Barberini, another Barberini, was a moderating influence, but the whole process was driven by Pope Urban VIII in a horrible way to a horrible conclusion to find Galileo guilty of heresy. This trial was not about science, it was not about the Bible. The second trial was over whether Galileo had disobeyed an injunction placed on him individually as part of the proceedings of 1616. This trial was about authority, power, obedience. And the Pope drove the decision of this trial. And the interesting thing is he broke two Roman Catholic Church laws in the process, which makes it very difficult for the Roman Catholic Church to quite clean it up. The first was that he based his decision on the unsigned note in the trial papers. Now, it was illegal to put an unsigned note in the trial papers. and it was also illegal to make any decisions out of it. But that's what the Pope did. And he had also made a cosmology an article of the faith, which is illegal without a church council. Galileo was forced to an abjuration, which is his only sensible move. As one historian said, he had nothing to do but to pay the price and go home. The scientific truth could take care of itself. He was a sick old man by this time. Copernicanism was declared false and completely contrary to Holy Scripture. Locked everything down now, lost any subtlety. It set Aristotelian science above Scripture, which Pope Urban VIII earlier had urged Galileo not to do with his new science. And interestingly, 3 of the 10 cardinals refused to sign the documents. Pope Urban VIII was convinced that Galileo had betrayed him, that Galileo had broken promises, and that he had been helped by men who had been the Pope's confidants and by whom the Pope had himself felt tricked. So he's developing a degree of paranoia with all this chaotic year going on there. Galileo was under house arrest. He was cared for by Archbishop Piccolomini and the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and he was not free even to seek medical care. And when you consider the medical care of the day, that's a mixed blessing. 1636, Galileo produced the 2 new sciences, in which he had toned down Simplicius, who had lost his pedantic and ridiculous character. So he'd learnt a little about diplomacy here. In 1638, he was visited by John Milton, who wrote Galileo into Paradise Lost as the Tuscan artist, and also wrote both the Copernican and the Ptolemaic universe into the poem as well. 1642, Galileo died, Newton was born. 1644, Pope Urban VIII died. 1651, Riccioli, a Jesuit astronomer, complained that the Copernicans were appealing to God's omnipotence to make their system work. They had no proof and they had no physics. They needed a God of the gaps. 1674, from England, Robert Hooke said that Copernicus had opened an astronomical can of worms because no one has proof of any model of the universe. Yes, they were all looking for it right across Europe, and nobody could measure the annual stellar parallax. By 1700, interestingly, most astronomers had accepted Copernicanism, despite the scientific evidence, difficulties, and despite the lack of proof. Interesting comment there. Jump to the 19th century, and John Henry Newman in 1826 preached a sermon against those who said that religion blocked the progress of science, which shows that this concept of a war between science and religion was around at least a generation before Draper, White and Lecky made it into their famous thesis. 1838, Bessel, of Bessel mathematical functions, observed measured annual stellar parallax of the star 61 Cygni. And here is his heliometer. Compare that with a simple telescope that Galileo had. This is vastly bigger and vastly more sophisticated. But the other important thing was that clocks had improved to the point where they could guarantee the time 6 months apart. That's another aspect that's forgotten about measuring stellar parallax. You have to have your time exact. Yes, so this is the last time you see this wonderful diagram. Aristotle's proof has finally been found. There's a few other minor problems with the whole system were also sorted out at this time. Stellar aberrations, star widths, falling bodies on a rotating Earth. And Newtonian physics explained how the Earth could move. So the whole thing was now in place scientifically. In 1856, the Vatican papers of the Galileo trial were released, and they were nowhere near as lurid as the rumours. It took a while to find these papers because in 1810 Napoleon had raided the Vatican Library and carted off hundreds of cartloads of documents, manuscripts, books and everything. He wanted to make France the centre of the world, and it caused a complete shambles. For instance, the papers of the trial of Bruno never came back, so nobody knows what actually happened there. But they did manage to find them eventually, and it included the unsigned note, which is of course stitched into the trial papers. So in 1862, Draper, White and Lecky used this set of trial papers and things to invent their war between science and religion, and they said that this was typical of the relationship between science and religion. Well, the interesting thing is, if it's typical, where's your second example? That, as I say, is a view of the Galileo trial from outside with a polemical goal, and they projected the findings back 200 or more years, and everyone failed to recognise that the trial was based on the best science of its day. You can't project it back like that, but they did. 1869 to 70, Vatican I was very conservative, defensive, absolutist, and you'll see the changes in this shortly. 1962 to 65, Vatican II, which changed all sorts of things. 1979, Pope John Paul II said that Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina had formulated important norms of an epistemological character which are indispensable to reconcile Holy Scripture and science. And as I say, I recommend you dig it up on the internet. And he said that the Roman Catholic Church may have erred in its handling of Galileo's trial. 1983, which is on the 350th anniversary of that trial of Galileo, the same Pope John Paul II, who within the last week has been canonised, sainted, said that the Galileo case has permitted a maturing and a more correct understanding of the authority which is proper to the Church. In other words, we are no longer the authority over everything. It's constrained. And this amazing statement, the Church founded by Christ, who has declared himself to be the way, the truth and the life, remains nonetheless composed of limited human beings who are an integral part of their cultural epoch. In other words, our institution can fail. Christ is the only infallible one. And this is enormously important because it was Vatican I that had said that the Pope was infallible. He's said, no. Then in 1994 he said, how can we then remain quiet about the many forms of violence perpetuated even in the name of the faith? The Church must also of its own initiative re-examine the obscure or the dark bits of its history and evaluate them in the light of the principles of the gospel, not of the institution. So my inside view is that the Galileo trial was about the control of scripture interpretation because of sola scriptura, given the best scientific evidence of the day. My conclusion is that this stupid Protestant 2-second soundbite of sola scriptura caused the trial of Galileo, which after 350 years reformed the Roman Catholic Church more than the Protestants ever did. Thank you.
The range. Whoops. You just about ready to start? John? All right, great. All right. Well, I thought that was a really great talk, Leonard, and you kept yourself well to get in the time, and you also gave us a lot of information. So now's the opportunity for all of you to either ask a question or make a comment. And Larry asked me a very interesting question during the break, so I'm going to ask him to actually re-express his question.
I'm just curious to know what the authority the Church had over state in actually condemning Galileo to what the dynamics there.
For this, you need to understand the structure of politics then and the so-called religious wars. The belief across Europe was that God anointed the church, appointed the church, which anointed the king, who appointed the government to govern the people. So the church was above everything. And this is what Pope John Paul II was disowning when he said that we now have to recognise the authority which is appropriate for the church. We don't have control over all the politics and the military and everything else, which they did have back in those days. And that is one of the huge changes that they just refused to recognise until the 350th anniversary of 1983. And this is also part of the problem with the child sex abuse stuff, that because the background view has always been that the church was above the state, then they did not report any of this to the police or anyone because they were above the police and the law and all of that. They were the ones who appointed the king and the government. And so that's what they've been in the process of unwinding, which has been so difficult for such a big, long-standing institution.
So when they actually condemned Galileo or had somebody else executed, like, did they kind of have their own executive government to
no,
implement that?
It was part of the system of stuff, of the structure of it all, that the church would condemn them, and this is what Calvin did also with Servetus. And then you send them off to the civil authority to execute them.
That sounds a little bit familiar.
Because the church was above all of
When
us.
the priests,
Sent them to Pilate, yes.
the priests decided Jesus needed to die, but they sent him to Pilate to do it.
Yep, same thing. And that's what they were doing at this time.
So they didn't have their own army or anything like that?
Well, there was a bit of a Vatican army for a while, but see, all of this time was awfully messy because Italy invaded the Vatican and all sorts of people invaded all around the place, and the Pope had to play a balancing act between all these powers to keep them all away from him. And that's why he used Protestant Sweden to shut down and negotiated behind the scenes to get Protestant Sweden, the superpower of Europe, to control the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because he was having trouble with the Habsburgs in Spain and France and elsewhere as well. So they worked more by balance of forces than direct force. And with threats and cajolings and otherwise.
You mentioned Aristotelians. Is that people who believed the Aristotelian cosmology, or is that a group of people who held more broadly to science or philosophy of Aristotle?
When Aristotle's writings came to the West through Spain and from the various manuscripts, Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus saw that this was the best sort of science and philosophy around. So they put a huge amount of effort into adapting Christianity to give it Aristotelian philosophical and scientific basis. There's often been this funny notion that Christianity needs a philosophical base, and so we've dragged in all sorts of philosophies. Aquinas dragged in Aristotelianism as the philosophical scientific base for Christianity, and so everybody from then on was brought up under an Aristotelian viewpoint of philosophy and science. And so when I say the Aristotelians, this was the academics in the university system who were teaching this as the formal doctrine of the West.
I was reading around the web once and stumbled across something that astounded me. I was looking up significant things in certain years, and I got to 1743, and I saw this law that was passed in France that anyone who objected to Aristotle could still be put to death. And there was a new law created in 1743 to underline that. People in France had better watch out, because if you disobey Aristotle's views, we can put you to death.
Yeah, and one of the problems with Vatican I was that it made Thomas Aquinas' adaptation of Aristotelianism as the official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. And they are having a lot of trouble undoing that. It's still there formally, but not practically.
Because they would believe it.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Jesuits, who were on an oath of obedience to the Pope and were mostly locked down to what they were allowed to believe, were the ones who were quietly making comments like, well, it appears to contradict Scripture, even up to the first and second trials. So the Jesuit scientists were not convinced. And that was the heyday of Jesuit science back then. they were the leaders before the Royal Society took over. But they couldn't say it openly because the Pope had locked it down.
I thought it was interesting how you linked in, you know, or showed the link with the sola scriptura,
Yes.
you know, as a catalyst for.
What I didn't have time to say there was that the Roman Catholic Church needed the Council of Trent to reform itself. And if they'd had that without the Protestant outbreak, they would never have referred to interpretation of Scripture. That bit is there only, and I checked this with the Roman Catholic historian, that bit is only in there because they saw the Protestants arguing, splitting, fighting each other all the time over this doctrine of sola scriptura, and everyone's free to interpret it. That's why they locked it down. But if the Protestants hadn't broken out, that would never have been in the Council of Trent.
But it seems to be, in a way, there's positives and negatives on both sides, because, you know, if you go with the Catholic view of listening to the interpretation, you do find yourself perhaps having to believe things that you don't really believe. But then, you know, I'm a Protestant, and yeah, I mean, it's a good point that, you know, we have so many different versions of ourselves, don't we? You know, and it does sometimes, yeah. So it's
Seem out of control.
hey?
It does seem out of control.
Yeah, it's fine.
So their centralised view was to provide a centralised lockdown on who could interpret Scripture. And they had problems with this because the only people who were free to interpret Scripture were those who were doctors of the Church.
Yeah.
And the big problem they had with the Reformation was that Martin Luther was a doctor of the Church.
Yeah.
So he was free to interpret Scripture.
Yeah.
There's another problem that the modern mind has with this story a bit, and it's been a problem I faced when I was younger. Copernicus' sun-centered system seems pretty obvious, and it was back there in very ancient history, pretty obvious also. And even though politically it seemed the incorrect thing to say for a period, it's still surprising that there weren't more people saying it. And yet, Ptolemy described the actual motion of the planets better than Copernicus did. And Kepler had a great deal of difficulty explaining it, but he was clever to see some relationships that no one else saw. And it wasn't until Isaac Newton came along that we had a simple mathematical explanation that that's the way elliptical orbits do behave. And you could simply solve the equations and find the answers of where things were. But Copernicus' system, thinking of circular motions, was much worse than Ptolemy's system for really explaining how things happened. When we observe Mars going by carefully, as our observations from Earth, we see Mars turn around and go backwards for a while, and then it turns around and goes forward again. And Ptolemy described that beautifully. But when you applied the circular mathematics of Copernicus, it didn't describe it well at all.
I thought they were about equal.
If you wanted equal accuracy, you ended up with equal complexity. The problem was, the difference was that Ptolemy described it more so that people could understand it, whereas Copernicus put it in enormously mathematical terms,
He
languages.
had horrible tabulated ways of doing it. They weren't just simple laws of nature.
You had
It
to
wasn't
be,
until you saw the natural ellipse that you saw the simple law.
and it was such a mathematical complexity that only mathematical astronomers could understand it. And this is why it didn't spread much.
That's right. That's how the old system lasted as long as it did.
And you say Newton was simpler. Well, Newton's Principia has just been described as the most unread bestseller in history. Because it actually is too complicated for almost all people in its own day.
This is true. It needs year 12 mathematics or better.
Yes.
Can I just ask about the scientific evidence that you made a lot about the annual stellar parallax and the inability to measure that until...
I never noticed that.
Anyway, there is also a lot of other evidence as to there was evidence as to substantiate the view of those who came before Aristotle. Otherwise, why would they have come up with the view? I mean, for a young age, a person without any scientific instruments or anything, it would be easy to imagine an Earth-centered universe. It's right, it seems solid,
And it seems
everything
stable.
else is going around up there. So that would seem to be the logical, primitive way of thinking that the Earth's the centre of everything. So why did the ancients think that the sun was the centre? Or was it the sun? Or was
Some of them thought that.
yeah. Well, they had some evidence.
Heraclitus, I've left Tycho Brahe's complex system out, but it looks as though Heraclitus had invented the system before Aristotle. But the problem is the documentation of these people is very poor. You've got to work out and their descriptions of it are not clear. So Aristotle probably had much more documentation that he was dealing with in discussing these people than what is left to us. So we don't know how much these ideas were around before Aristotle.
We do know one field very well that I discovered recently. Mankind has been measuring this winter and summer equinoxes very, very accurately since right back at the day of Pythagoras. And they were comparing the measurements of the shadow on a post very, very accurately. They had a special name for their post. They were putting them up all over the place, down in Egypt, over in France, up in Germany, over in England, the Stonehenge, and all these places. Down in South America, the Aztecs were doing it. The Chinese were doing it from way back in history. They've all been measuring the equinoxes. They've all correctly measured the tilt of the Earth's axis from that. They've all correctly picked out the seasons exactly. And so they knew the sun-centered solar system made an awful lot of sense, even in very ancient times.
Sorry, pardon my ignorance.
The
Why
tilt
does
of-
that prove a sun-centered universe?
The tilt of the axis is 23.5 degrees, and it causes summer and winter.
Yeah, I know, but why would they could still think the sun goes across there and then it moves across the coast?
But they knew the measurements behind it, and they knew there was a very good reason to think the sun was at the centre of things. Because those measurements were so precise and accurate at predicting eclipses and seasons and tilt of the axis.
But the thing is, the astronomers at this time understood the mathematical interchangeability between the sun-centered universe, the earth-centered universe, and Tycho Brahe's double-centered universe. And they saw the mathematical interchangeability of the whole thing, so nothing came out with any priority because, as I said, equal accuracy demanded equal complexity.
I believe another very early piece of evidence that the ancients could see was eclipses of the moon. Such that the Earth's shadow is on the moon, and some of them deduced that was the Earth's shadow, that the sun was opposite.
Oh, that's a different issue.
Yeah.
Because
That
that
gives you
actually
a round
demonstrates that the Earth is round. They believe the Earth is round. But the other issue is whether it was the centre of rotation.
That was one of Aristotle's 7 arguments for the Earth being a sphere.
Yeah. Okay. So from very early days, many understood that the Earth was round.
Well,
Yeah.
see, the Plato theory was invented in 1832 by a French atheist named Latron, who went through early church fathers and manipulated about half a dozen quotes to saying that, see, these old fools believe the Earth was flat.
Yeah.
But if you look back there at the evidence, nobody believed the Earth was flat. They all knew it was round. There was just how big it was and does it move? That was a major question. That was one of the sections I had to cut out. One of the many.
So,
It will.
yeah, so, you seem to have a very sympathy for the Catholic tradition.
Well, I'm surprised that they haven't mounted a better defence for themselves.
Yeah.
You're not a Catholic.
But you're not a Catholic.
No. But when I looked into all of this, I thought, why haven't they said this?
Yeah.
Why do you
It's the
say-
same thing with my major thesis is about deism. And in the late 19th century, one of the popes came out with this article condemning modernism. And I look at this and I think, how come with all that brain power, philosophical and theological brain and historical brain power there in the Vatican, they can't see that what he's calling modernism was actually the deist corruption of Christianity. The system seems so big that it misses these things.
Institutional church is clumsy.
Institutional, anything gets clumsy.
Yeah.
You look at the so-called health system.
We've heard about that around, so I think that came back to it.
Well, we worked in the defence, didn't we? And that's another monolith.
Let's hope they're not too clumsy.
Oh, yeah. I've seen some pictures.
Two holes in both.
Near Atlantic.
So in researching this, have you come to any views yourself on interpreting scripture? And I mean, this is right where it was back there for Galileo. You know, where scripture and science, but we have our own scripture and science debates today.
But it went on with the early church fathers as well.
Yeah.
And that's why they said, no, leave it to the scientists. They're only studying God's handiwork, so it's not going to give us any troubles.
Yeah.
Our job is much more important than that.
Yeah. Okay. And is that your own view?
Yes.
Yeah, one of the quite famous
Origin is wonderful on this if you want to look up somebody. About AD 200 in Alexandria. I love the Alexandrian school of early theology. I think that the Greek Alexandrian school is wonderful, but the Latin corrupting school out there in Hippo and Carthage was corrupted the Western Church. But don't start me on that. That's
Well, I'd love to start you on that. That sounds fascinating. Will you talk to us about that sometime?
We'll invite him back.
There is a fascinating diagram of the split between Greek and Latin, and it's the Latin interpretation and Latin language and its limitations which has corrupted the Western Church. And the Reformers took it on. They didn't understand what they were continuing.
One of the quotes that I'm surprised you didn't mention from Galileo is he said that the scripture tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go.
That was one of the many slides that disappeared.
But like was his attitude towards interpreting scripture.
Yes. And this is what Origen said, that we're about far more important things than the mechanical operation of the universe. Let's just go how God made it all work. Don't worry about it.
Although, I mean, you know, some would say that we have a mandate to check it all out, you know, if we're going to be the vice regents here.
A lot of people would have agreed with that over the last few centuries.
Yeah.
But those debates were there in the early church. Because what you need to put this in context is that Democritus was an atheist who overlapped with Plato. And Democritus invented atheism, materialism, determinism, atoms in a void, evolution and anti-design arguments. And one of my papers is about how the whole modern world, so-called, is actually derived from Democritus.
And when was Democritus
I
around?
never even heard
He
of it.
overlapped with Plato.
So around about 400
BC, yeah.
400 years. I never even heard of him.
Well,
Obviously that's where democracy comes from.
Is that where the word democracy comes from?
No.
No, it was massage.
That's where the so-called modern world. That's another But one thing, don't start.
The only atomic theory was that you could cut things into very small pieces and you'd get to a little piece of substance which could no longer be divided. It was called the atomic theory.
Sounds pretty good, actually, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And how many elements were in their periodic table then?
There were many people who disagreed with him at that time, but they were just philosophers, not scientists.
But it sounds as though he was basically right, though, wasn't he?
He was right, Democratic right, yeah.
But there's so much known and thought about all of this that by 300 BC with answers.
Somebody, right?
Yeah, somebody. Anyway, they could have a full-scale debate on the origin of the universe and everything. Is it due to mind or is it due to chance? There was a full-scale debate there in Greece and Rome, outside the biblical story altogether. They had all of these theories all worked out back there. And one of the things I didn't mention about Aristotle was that he decided that there was no creation, the universe was eternal.
Well, he was wrong there.
Well,
But
I
see,
should.
that's part of his cosmology, which is irrelevant to the line I've run, so I left it all out, amongst other bits.
Right. Anybody else who's got any comments or questions?
I think he carried on so very well.
you're filling a lot of gaps.
All right. Well, so we don't have to stretch it out to fill the time.
No.
So I'd just say it was much better than I expected. no, honestly, it's really surprised me. And your knowledge is immense, and it was very interesting and informative. I think everybody appreciated it. And
You've got about 1% of what I know on the Aristotle, the Galileo trial, and the Boffin I do most of my work with, I know about 1% of what he knows. So.
yeah. So would you like to stay on for a bit longer while he elucidates the remaining 99%? Perhaps we'll leave it till another night. But,
2 other nights.
yeah. All right. So that was really wonderful. So thank you very much. And feel free to hang around and chat and finish off the supper or whatever. And so thank you for coming. But